React Developer Tools. Coming to today's agenda. In today's session, we are going to see about component lifecycle. So a component goes through three different phases. So there's mounting phase, updating phase, and unmounting phase. We'll understand about each of these phases. And for each of these phases, there are corresponding methods involved. So we'll understand about those methods too, right? For mounting phase, there's constructor, render, component did mount. In case of updating phase, it's render. In case of unmounting phase, this component will unmount. So we'll understand these methods too, okay? To set the code breakdown for today's session, you need to run this command and then run npm install so that all the dependencies will get installed. Okay. So now let's understand about component lifecycle. Okay. So every React component that you see, okay, it will go through three different phases. Okay. Firstly, mounting, and then updating, and then finally unmounting. So the component you're able to see in the UI, right? So that's possible because a component will go through the mounting phase. So in the mounting phase, the component will be rendered into the UI. Okay. So that is a mounting phase. So the next thing is, in case of any change to the component state object, right? So the entire component will be re-rendered, right? So it will be updated. So that is the updating phase. Okay. So and let's say we want to remove the component from the UI, right? So then the component will go through the unmounting phase. Okay. So you can see that there are three phases. So there's mounting. So if you want to render the component into the UI, so the component has to go through the mounting phase in which the component will be displayed in the UI. Okay. So then in case of any change to the state object, so the entire component will be re-rendered. So that is the updating phase. And if you want to remove the component from the UI, then the component will go through the unmounting phase. Okay. So these are the three phases. Okay, let's understand more in detail. Coming to the mounting phase. So in the mounting phase, the component's instance will get created. Okay, there'll be some component code, right? So an instance of this will get created in the mounting phase. Okay, now we have the instance of the component. The next step is we have to insert that into the DOM, right? So we previously understood about the HTML DOM, where various HTML elements will be arranged in a tree-like structure, right? So the instance that we have created should get inserted into this HTML DOM. Okay, so now let's say in our component we have div. Okay, within the div there is h1 and button, and for the h1 the text is hello, and for the button text is submit. Okay, so this tree-like structure has to be inserted into the DOM. Now let's say we want to insert this as a child to the div root element. Okay, so there you can see. So this will also happen in the mounting phase. So with this insertion into the DOM, finally we'll be able to see the component in the UI. Okay, so for the component to be displayed in the UI, so firstly an instance of the component has to be created, then the instance has to be inserted into the DOM, and then we'll be able to see the component in the UI. So in the mounting phase, so the instance will be created and it will be inserted into the DOM. Okay, with this the component will be displayed in the UI. Okay, now the mounting phase is done. Another phase is updating phase, right? So in case of any change to the component state, right, then the entire component has to be re-rendered, right? That is, the component has to be updated. So that is the updating phase, where the render method will be called and the entire component will be re-rendered. Okay, so that is the updating phase. So in the mounting phase, the component will be displayed in the UI, and in the updating phase, with the change in the state, appropriately the component will be re-rendered. Now coming to the unmounting phase. Okay, so in the unmounting phase, we want to remove the component from the UI. So how do we do it? By removing the instance from the DOM, right? So the component is displayed because the instance is present in the DOM, right? It's attached to the DOM. Now to remove the component from the UI, we have to simply remove the instance from the DOM, right? That is the unmounting phase. Okay, so in the mounting phase, the component will be displayed in the UI by creating an instance and attaching it to the DOM. And then in the updating phase, so the component will be re-rendered with a change in the state object. And in the unmounting phase, the instance of the component will be removed from the DOM. Okay. So these are the three phases. So now let's take an example and understand the various phases of this life cycle. Okay, so let's build a clock example. Okay, there you can see on the top we have a button, and then below that there is clock. Okay, where the time is appropriately being updated. Okay, so let's understand the various phases here. Okay, so initially there is a button with the text show clock. Okay, so that is the app component, and then when the user clicks on the show clock, we want to display the clock below. Okay, so consider that as a component. So we want to mount this clock component. Okay, there you can see, right? So here, since we are displaying the clock, the time has to be appropriately updated, right? So then the clock will go through the update phase, right? The updating phase. Okay, there you can see. So if you observe that previously the button text was show clock, and once the clock has been displayed, the clock text has been updated to hide clock. Okay. So now if we click on the hide clock, right, so appropriately the clock below has to be removed from the UI. That is the unmounting phase. So we have to unmount the clock, right? So these are the various phases involved. So by clicking on the show clock, so the clock has to be displayed, that is the mounting phase. And then the time has to be appropriately updated after every 1 second. That is the updating phase. And finally, so we have to remove the clock component on clicking on hide clock. That is the unmounting phase. Okay, so you understood the various phases involved for the clock component in this particular example, right? Now, let's build this. Okay, so for that, already some pre-filled code is available for you, right? There you can see, right? We already have provided the clock component, and then also in the app.js and app.css, the application logic is present. Okay, so in the clock component index.js, we have the clock related component code, and then in the index.css file, the corresponding styling is present. Similarly, in the app.js, we have the application logic, and in app.css, the corresponding styling is available. Okay, so this is a sample of the initial code. There you can see we have the app component, right, in which we have the container, and then within that we have the button and the clock component, right? So now if you run npm start, then you will be able to see an output in this manner. Okay, let's give this a try. So here you can see I have already set the code background for today's session. Okay, so now let's run npm start. Okay, so now localhost :3000. So with this, you can see this output, right? So on the top, we have the hide clock, and below that, we have the clock, right? So the clock text, okay? So once, let's have a look at the code also, right? So within the source, you can see we have app.js, okay? Let's click allow. And then within the components, so there's a clock component. Within this, we have index.css and index.js, okay? So here in the index.js, so you can see that we have the clock component. So within this, so we have the clock container where we have the text as the clock, the heading as the clock, okay? So this is the clock component, and in the app.js file, so here we have the app component, right, within which we are having a div container, the app container, and then we have a button inside it, okay, with the hide clock text, and then there is the clock component. So that's the reason we are able to see this UI. Okay, clear? So there's the initial code. Okay, so on top of this, we'll start building. Okay. So we have seen this, right? Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll show the clock by clicking on the button. So if the user clicks on the show clock button, so then the clock should be displayed, and then the clock text should change as hide clock. And now if the user clicks on the hide clock button, and then the clock component should disappear, right? So this is what we want to achieve, right? Based on the button click, appropriately we want to show the clock or the hide the clock. Okay, this is what we want to do. Okay, so for that, firstly, we can understand that over the time, whether to show the clock or whether to hide the clock is varying, right? So when a particular thing is varying over the time, and based on that, if the UI is changing, then what do we have to do? We have to maintain that in the state object, right? Because whether to display the clock or not, this is changing over the time, right? So that we have to maintain in the state object, right? So there you can see, right, in the app component, right? So the entire whether to display the clock component or not is controlled in the app.js file, right? So by the app component. So that's the reason in the state object of the app component. So we are going to maintain whether to show clock or not. Okay, so for that, there you can see we have show clock. Initially, it's false. So initially, we are not displaying the clock. Okay, so we are maintaining that in the state object. So now the next thing is, so based on the state, appropriately the button text should be updated, right? So there you can see, right, in the render method, we are accessing the show clock, and then if the show clock is true, then the text should be hide clock, right? So if the clock is being displayed, the next thing that the user has to do is hide the clock, right? So we'll display is hide clock. Okay, and then in case the show clock is false, so then the text should be show clock, right? So there you can see the corresponding code is written there. So within the curly braces, if the show clock is true, then the hide clock should be displayed. So question mark, hide clock is the first one. Colon, if the show clock is false, so then the text should be show clock. So we have written show clock there. Okay, so with this, appropriately the button text is being controlled by the state object, right? So in the state we have the show clock, so based on that, appropriately we are controlling the button text. Okay, so the next thing is that, so on clicking the button, we have to appropriately change whether the clock should be displayed or not, right? So we have to toggle that, right? So if the clock is currently present, so we have to remove the clock from the UI, right? If the clock is not present in the UI, then it has to be displayed. So this is nothing but called as toggling, right? So for this, let's have a event listener. So on click equal to this dot on toggle clock, and there you can see the corresponding event listener we have written on the top using arrow function. Okay, so now let's understand what do we have to do in this event listener. Okay, so here By clicking on the button, what should happen? Whether to display the clock or not. Okay, so that should get toggled, right? So if previously the clock is being shown, so it has to be disappear, it has to hide. Okay, if the clock is in hidden state, so then it has to be displayed, right? So here, what do we have to do? We have to update the state object, because in the state object, we are maintaining whether to show the clock or whether to hide the clock, right? So that is being maintained in the state object, right? So now let's update the state. Okay, so this dot set state of. Now there are two ways, either to use the object syntax or the callback. Okay, so here in our case, so the show clock will vary based on the previous state. If previously the show clock is true, now we have to set it as false. If previously the show clock was false, so then we have to set it as true, right? So here this is dependent on the previous state. So we'll make use of the callback function. So for the callback, the previous state will be passed as an argument. So there within that, you can see that we got the show clock from the previous state. So then we are basically assigning the reverse of it to the show clock. Okay, there you can see we are returning an object where the show clock is just the reverse of the previous state. Okay, so with this, we are toggling the show clock, right? So once the state object is updated, appropriately the render method will be called, and in the render method, we are accessing the show clock, and based on the show clock, we will handle appropriately, right? Clear? So you understood the flow. Now, let's do these steps till now. Okay. So as you can see that here we have the app component, so in the app.js. So now we understood that we have to maintain in whether to show clock or not in the state object of the app, right? Because it's varying over the time. Okay, so now I'll write state equal to, so within this I'm maintaining show clock. So initially it's false. Okay, so I've maintained it here. Okay, so now I'll access the state within the render method. Okay, so this dot state. So from this I want to access the show clock. So constant show clock equal to this dot state. So with this I'm accessing the show clock. Okay, so the next thing is, based on the show clock, we have to update the button text. Okay, so let's do that. So I'll add a piece of code here. So if the show clock is true, so then what do we have to display? Hide clock, right? So let's write that, hide clock. So in case if it is false, we have to display show clock, right? So we have written that part of code here. Okay, clear? Right, so now based on the state object, we are displaying the button text. The next thing is, right, on the button click, we have to toggle this show clock, right? So let's add an event listener for that. So on click equal to, okay, so here we have to assign an event listener, right? So this dot on toggle, what shall we call, on toggle clock, right? We are toggling the clock. Okay, so let's write an event listener for this. Okay, so this would be an arrow function, since event listeners has to be written as arrow functions. Okay, so we have written this here. Okay, so now within this on toggle clock, what do we want to do? Okay, so based on the previous state, okay, we want to toggle that, right? So we want to update the state object. So if previously the show clock was true, we want to update this as false. If it was previously false, then we want to update it as true, right? So for that, we want to update the state object. So for that, we have to make use of this dot set state method. So to which here we are going to make use of the callback. Okay, so here the previous state will be sent as a parameter to the callback. So within this, based on the previous state, we want to update the current state, right? So firstly, let's access the show clock here. So from the previous state. Okay, so now we want to return the state object. So where the show clock will be nothing but the reverse of the previous state, right? So not of show clock. Okay, so previously it was true, then now it will be false, right? Previously if it was false, then now it will be true because of this negation. Okay, so with this, we are basically updating the state object. Okay, so now let's have a look at the output so far. Okay, so now you can see, I'll just refresh this. So you can see here, we have the show clock. So by clicking on this, so the button text has changed to hide clock. Okay, so then again I'm clicking, now it has turned into show clock, right? So you can see that is being toggled. With the button click, the text has been toggled. Okay, so we are done with this so far. Okay, so we have seen this output, right? Okay, now let's proceed further. Okay, so far the button text has been updated, but whereas we want to control the clock component display too, right? So we have to appropriately update the clock component, whether it has to be displayed or whether it has to be removed from the UI, right? So let's see how to do it. So generally, how do we do it, right? So already the show clock is being maintained in the state variable, right? So if you do if of that show clock, so if it is true, then we'll display the clock, otherwise we'll not display, right? So we can write an if condition here. Okay, here there is actually a short syntax that we can follow. Okay, that is using the logical and operator. Okay, so here, if the show clock is true, we want to display the clock component. If it is false, we don't want to display, right? So for this, you can directly write it in this manner. Okay, so within the curly braces, so you can see we have written show clock and then we have mentioned the clock component. So if the show clock is true, then the right side one will be rendered. Okay, so if the left one is true, that is the show clock is true, then the clock component will be rendered. So if the show clock is false, so then the clock component will not be rendered. Okay, so in this way, we can make use of this logical and operator. Using this simply without using any if or something, you can directly write it here. Okay, so now if the show clock is true, then the clock component will be displayed. If the show clock is false, so then the clock component will not be displayed. Okay, simple. Now let's give this a try. Okay. So far here in the code, right, we were able to update the button text based on the show clock state, right? So we also want to display whether the clock should be present or not based on the show clock, right? Currently, whatever it may be, right? So the clock is being displayed, but whereas it has to be controlled, right? So let's do that, okay? So for that, as we understood, there is a short syntax where we can make use of the logical and operator. So we have the show clock, right? So if the show clock is true, then the clock component will be displayed. If it is false, then it won't be displayed, okay? Clear? So now let me save this and I'll show you the output. So currently the clock component is not present, right? Now if you click on this, there you can see now the clock component has been displayed, right? So appropriately based on the show clock, so the clock is being controlled. Okay, clear? So yeah, we understood this clearly, right? Okay. So now we have seen this output. By clicking on show clock, the clock is being displayed, and by clicking on hide clock, appropriately the clock is disappearing from the UI, right? So here, let's understand the phases that the clock component has gone through, right? So initially you can see that by clicking on the show clock button, the clock component is being mounted, right? So the clock component is going through the mounting phase, right? So then again, by clicking on the hide clock button, right? So the clock component is being removed from the UI. So the clock component is going through the unmounting phase. Okay, so here it's going through the mounting phase and then unmounting phase. Okay, so this is the flow that is going right now. Okay, so now let's proceed further. So far we have built it till here. Okay, there's one point to note, that is in every phase of a component life cycle, there are some methods using which we can effectively control the behavior of the component. Okay, some additional things we can control regarding the component during each and every phase. Okay, so in every phase of a component life cycle, there are some methods involved using which we can control the behavior of the component in a more effective manner. So let's understand how in regarding each of the phases. Okay, so firstly, let's start with the mounting phase. Okay, so the methods involved in the mounting phase are constructor, render, and component-didmount. So in this phase, we basically use these three methods: constructor, render, and component-didmount. Okay, so in the mounting phase, so initially the constructor method will get called, so then the render method will be called, okay, and finally the component-didmount method will be called. Okay, this is the flow. So firstly the constructor will be called, and then the render, and then the component-didmount. So let's understand about each of these methods. So in the constructor method, we set the initial state and the class variables, right? So this would be a class component. So for this, there'll be some class variables. So to set the class variables and to set the initial state object, right? So we'll make use of the constructor method. Okay, the next method is render. Okay, so using the render method, we return the JSX element that needs to be displayed in the UI. Okay, so in the render method, we'll return the JSX that needs to be displayed in the UI. Okay, clear? So now coming to component-didmount. So in the component-didmount method, we'll do the operations on the component after the render. Okay, so once the component has been rendered, okay, so let's say we want to do some operations. Okay, we'll do them in the component-didmount method. Like let's say setting the timers, initiating the API calls, right? All these things will be done in the component-didmount method. Okay, so you understood that there are three methods involved. Okay, in the constructor, we'll set the initial state object and the class variables. And then in the render method, we'll return the JSX that has to be displayed in the UI. And finally, in the component-didmount method, so we'll do the operations that are related to after rendering the component. So after rendering the component in the UI, let's say we want to do some operations, we'll do them in the component-didmount. Some of them are setting the timers, initiating the API calls, like this. Okay. So now let's understand about each of these methods in detail. Okay, so firstly about the constructor method. Okay, so there you can see for the clock, which is a class component. Okay, so within that we have written the constructor method to which the props is passed as an argument. Okay, so there you can see within that we first call super of props. Okay, so with this, so we are extending the component, right, from the React. So the constructor of that will get called. Okay, so we need to call super of props method before any other statement in the constructor method. So in the constructor method, so first thing is you have to call super of props, and then you can do the remaining things there. Okay, so here coming to the clock, which is our class component. So we want to set the state object, right? So as we know that the time in the clock component will vary, right? So that is changing over the time. Okay, so that's the reason we are going to maintain that in the state object. So we are setting the state object initially in the constructor method. So this dot state equal to, so there you can see date colon new date. So we actually want to store the time, but we are storing the entire date so that from that we can extract the time. Okay, clear? So since the time is varying over the time, right? So we have to maintain that in the state object, right? So we are maintaining that there in this manner. Okay, so the initialization of the state object will happen in the constructor method. Okay, there you can see. So the next thing is, so based on the date, based on the time present in the state object, so we have to appropriately render the UI, right? So we'll access that from the state object, and then there you can see the output in this manner. Okay, since we are printing the date there, so we are able to see an output in this manner. Okay, so let's do these steps. So now we are currently talking about the clock component, right? So let's go to the index.js of the clock component. So here you can see, right? So as we understood, so in the mounting phase, there are three methods involved: constructor, render, component did mount. Okay. So firstly, we'll talk about the constructor. So the syntax is constructor, to which the props will be passed as an argument. So within this, we understood that first we have to call super of props. Okay, the reason is you can see that we are extending the component, right? So we have to call the constructor of that too. So that's the reason we are doing super of props. Okay, then later on we can set the class variables, the state object, we can do all of these things later on. Okay, so now here we want to set the state object, okay, initial state. So this dot state equal to, so in the state object we want to maintain the date time. Okay, so the reason for that is, so here appropriately in the clock we want to display the clock time, right? So it has to vary, it will be varying, right? So that's the reason we are maintaining that in the state object. So for now let's have it as date, so in which both the date and time will be present. So there you can see we are maintaining that in the state object. Okay, so now let's access the state object in the render method, so that will update the UI based on that. Okay, so constant date equal to this dot state. So with this we'll get the date. So now let's just display, later on we'll update the UI. So I'm just displaying the date. Okay, so let's have a look at the output. So I'm going to inspect, since we have a console log statement. So here in the console, okay, so there you can see the output, right? So again I'll do, so whenever the mounting is happening, you can see the output there. Okay, so there you can see, right? Okay, so we have seen this output, right? Okay, so now appropriately here, if you want to set the state based on the props, you can make use of the props that has been passed as an argument, right? There you can see props dot date, you can access it in this manner, and then you can set the state object based on the props. Okay, so there you can see we are passing the date, and then we are able to access that date through the props, okay, which is passed as a parameter to the constructor method, and then we are setting the state based on the props. You can always do this. Okay, clear? So now let's add few console log statements for each of these methods. As we understood, there are three methods involved: constructor, render, component did mount, right? So let's add these console log statements and see the order of being called, right? We understood that first the constructor will be called, then the render, then the component did mount. So using the console log statements, let's have a look at the output. Okay. So here in the constructor, let me add a console log statement. So console log constructor called. Okay. Whereas in the render, we'll add another console log statement. So console.log of render called. So let's add the component did mount method also. So in which I'll add a console log statement. Component did mount called. Okay. So just few console log statements to see the order of being called. Okay. So I'll inspect. So let's go to the console. Let me clear this. Okay, so now let's appropriately display, so that you can see once the component has been rendered here, right? So first the constructor has been called, then the render has been called, and then the component did mount has been called, right? So again, let's have a look at this. So I'm clicking on show clock. With this, the component will be displayed, right? The mounting phase will happen. So there you can see first the constructor, then the render, and finally the component did mount, right? Clear? So we understood the order of these methods being called, right? So let me just remove these statements. Okay. So we have seen the order, right? Firstly, the constructor will be called, then the render, then the component did mount. So generally, when we are writing the methods, we first write the constructor, then we write the component did mount, and finally the render will be the last method that we write. So this is generally the convention that people follow. So the render will be the last method that will be written in the class component. So firstly, the constructor will be there, and then the component did mount, and finally the render. Okay, so that's the reason we have written it in this manner. And we were able to see this output, right? Okay. So Now let's display the time, right? So as we already have it present in the date, right? Let's access that. Okay, so then we'll write date dot to local time string. So using this method, okay, so there you can see in the below we have written a paragraph element. So within that we have written date dot to local time string. So with this, from the date the time will get extracted. Okay, so for that we can make use of this to local time string method. Okay, so with this we'll get the time and we are displaying that there in the UI, right? There you can see the output. Okay, let's have a look at this. So now in the render method, we have accessed the date. So using this date, we want to display the time in the UI. So we have the paragraph element. So the corresponding styling is a class name equal to time. Okay, so now coming to this, here we want to display the time, whereas we have the entire date present. So from the date to extract the time. So this is actually the date and time together present in this. Okay, so from this, we want to extract the time, right? We can make use of the method date dot to local date time string. So we want the time string, so time string. Okay, so with this we are accessing the time. Okay, so let me save this and let's have a look at the UI. So there you can see now the time has been appropriately displayed. Okay, clear? Cool. So we have seen the output, right? Okay, so this so far we have seen about the mounting phase, right? So where for firstly the component in the constructor we are setting the state object, then the entire component is being rendered in the UI, right? Now we are going to see about the updating phase. Okay, so let's understand this. So in the update phase, so as we previously understood that with the change in the state object, the entire component will be re-rendered, right? So when the component's state will be updated, so then the render method will be called. So the entire component will be re-rendered. So in case of any change to the component state, so then the render method will be called and the component will be re-rendered. Okay, so that is the flow, right? So here you can see, right? So in the mounting, so we understood that the constructor, render, and the component did mount. These are the methods that will be called in this order. Whereas in case of the updating phase, so you can see that the render method will be called. So with the change in the state, right, the render method will get called. Okay. So there you can see, right, now in our case, so what is the change that we want to apply? The time should be updated over the, right, so the time has to be updated, right? So for that, so already in the state object, we are maintaining it, right? So we have to update that every second, right? So then we can make use of the set interval method. As we previously understood, in the component did mount, so we'll be generally setting the timers and doing all of these things, right? So in the component did mount, so we are doing set interval off and then we are passing the callback this dot take comma and this has to be called every 1 second, that is 1000 milliseconds. So we are specifying 1000 there. Okay, this will return a timer ID which we can make use to clear the interval later on. Okay, so there you can see with this the timer will be set. Okay, so coming to the callback function, so there we are updating the state object with the current time. Okay, so there you can see, since it's independent of the previous, so we'll write date colon new date. So with this, the state object will be updated, then the render method will be called, and then appropriately in the UI, the time will be updated, right? Okay, so that's the advantage. Okay, so with this, you'll be able to see an output in this manner. So where the time will be appropriately updated, and you can see the console log statements there. Okay, so let's try this out. So now at present in the UI you can see the time is fixed there, but whereas we want to update it after every 1 second, right? So the time has to be updated. So for that the component will go through the update phase, right? So for that we have to appropriately update the state object. Okay, so we'll set interval. Okay, we'll create a timer. So we are writing the set interval because in the component did mount generally we create the timers interval off and then we have to provide a callback. So let's just call this dot tick comma and it has to be called every 1 second, so 1000 milliseconds. So this will actually return a timer ID. So let's set that as an instance variable which we'll make use of later on to clear the interval. Okay, so now let's write this callback. Okay, so tick equal to, let's have an arrow function here, so in which we are going to update the state object. So this dot set state. So here independent of the previous state, we just want to update it with the current time. So date colon new date. So we are using the object syntax and we are updating the state object. Okay, so there you can see now the state has been updated, right? So with this, so let's have a look at the output. Okay, so there you can see the time has been updated. Let's again see this. So there you can see the time has been updated, right? Okay, so here if you observe in the render method we have a console log statement. Let's have a look at an output of this. So I'll inspect. So coming to the console, let me just clear this for now. So now let's click on show clock. So you can see that based on the update in the time, so there you can see the console log statements, right? So the render method is being called every time and then appropriately the time here is being updated. Okay, clear? So we understood this, right? So in the update phase, each time the render method will be called and appropriately the entire component will be re-rendered, right? Okay. So we have seen this output, right? Okay. So with this, we are done with a mounting phase. With this, the clock will be mounted and then the time there is being updated. That is the updating phase of the clock component, right? So now let's understand about the unmounting phase, right? So now, when will the unmounting phase come into picture? When we click on the hide clock button, so then the component that is being present there below has to be removed from the UI. So it has to go through the unmounting phase. Okay, so generally in the unmounting phase, there is a method which is component will unmount. So when the component is being unmounted, this method will get called. So generally we make use of this method to perform some cleanup activities, like let's say clearing the timers or cancelling the API calls in this manner. So to perform these things, we'll make use of this component will unmount method. So this is the method related to unmounting phase. Okay, so there's mounting phase, updating phase, and then in the unmounting phase, we'll call this component will unmount method. So that will get called by the React. Okay, clear? So in the mounting phase, constructor will be called, then render, then the component did mount. In the updating phase, with a change in the state object, the render method will be called. In the unmounting phase, the component will unmount method will be called. Okay, so as we understood, in this method, we generally do the cleanup activities like clearing the timers, cancelling the API calls. So here in our case of the clock example, so we have to clear the interval, right? So that we'll do in the component will unmount method. So there you can see we are clearing the interval. So we have to provide the timer ID, which we already stored as an instance variable. So we'll provide that this.timer ID. So with this, the interval that we have created would be cleared. Okay, so with this, you'll be able to see an output in this manner saying component will unmount call, and then the component will no longer be present there. Okay, so let's give this a try. Okay, so now as we understood, right, so we have seen about the mounting phase and the updating phase. Now we have to proceed further to the unmounting phase. During the unmounting phase, component will unmount will method will be called, right? So let's write that method. So component will unmount. Okay. So in this method, we generally have the cleanup activities that should be performed before the component unmounts. Okay, like let's say clearing the interval. Okay, so here in our case, we want to clear the interval, right? So we'll write clear interval of, and then we have to provide the timer ID, which we already stored in the as an instance variable here, right? So we'll just provide that this.timer ID. Okay, so with this, the interval will get cleared. Okay, so we'll also have a console log statement to understand when it has been called. Component will unmount. Okay. So yeah, there's one thing. So as it's mentioned, so the stick should be present after the component will unmount. So I'm just moving that below this. Okay. So there you can see now the compilation is successful. So let's have a look at the output. Okay, I'm clicking on inspect. So console, I clear this hide clock. So there you can see when I clicked on hide clock, so the component will unmount has been called and the interval also has been created. Okay. So there you can see, right? Okay. So we have seen this output, right? Okay. So what if we don't clear the timer? Okay. So if you don't clear the timer, there you can see we have set the interval in the component did mount method, but whereas during the unmounting, let's say we haven't cleared the timer, right? So then you will get a warning in this manner. So in the console, if you open, right, you'll get a warning in this manner. Okay. So it says that you cannot perform a React state and so and so, so and so, right? Before on update on an unmounted, all this, right? So this is we have to clear these warnings. So for that, what do we have to do? We have to simply clear the interval, right? Okay, so you can try this out once. Okay. So there's one point to note, right? When it comes to the constructor method, what do we have done? So we have written constructor of props. Within that we call super of props and set the initial state, right? So this is actually an older approach. Coming to the modern approach. So in the modern approach, we need not write the constructor method and set the state inside that. You can directly write state equal to in this manner. Okay, there you can see. So this is actually the modern approach. Okay, so we understood both of these. So you can stick with the modern approach. Okay, so what did we learn in today's session? So let me summarize. So in today's session, we understood about the various phases involved in a component lifecycle. Firstly, the mounting phase, using which the component will be displayed in this. The component will be displayed in the UI. Then we understood the various methods involved in this phase, the constructor method, render method, and the component did mount, right? Then another phase is updating phase, right? So in case of any change to the state object, so then the component will go through the updating phase, where the render method will be called and the entire component will be re-rendered, right? So in case if you want to remove the component from the UI, right, then the component will go through the unmounting phase when the component will unmount method will be called, right? So these are the various things